Hello, and welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we are offering you more awareness of the narratives that dominate your world. Today, we will be discussing the narrative and archetype of the unbreakable warrior, one of the hidden immortality and strength narratives that persists across cultures. I'm Jessica Buchleitner, your resident journalist.
And I'm Angela Natividad, your resident mythologist.
So let's discuss why these unbreakable warriors are so famed and revered. So the unbreakable warrior, it sounds like this immortal being that can never die, can never be taken down by any other force. And in fact, this is kind of the right idea when we're thinking about this. There are some narratives that favor this type of unbreakable narratives, and I'm sure, Angela, in mythology, there are these type of or archetypes of characters that we see in myths. But from the angle that I'm coming at it from my piece is that we like the thought of being able to live forever. We have this natural tendency and a subconscious tendency from time to time to want to pursue something that we think will give us immortality. And that's because humans are born with awareness that we are finite beings. All of the principles of thermodynamics and metaphysics and science tell us that one day our energy will be transformed and transmuted into some other form. We will leave this planet. Whether or not we will re-enter this planet is, of course, part of a reincarnation narrative, which we could do an episode on in the future. I think we should, actually. But the point of me saying this is that we want to and strive to survive, to live forever. And this unbreakable warrior narrative is such a powerful one because it's kind of like a dual narrative and archetype. It's a narrative in that it says to you that you can't be destroyed, you can't be taken down, you will live forever, you will echo through the centuries, you will have, I don't know, monuments and statues erected in your honor. That could be one part of it. And then the other part is an archetype. So this is a type of character that we often see in literature and mythology that, and even in stories about nationalities, which I'll get into in a moment, that have persisted through the centuries and through many different stories. There always seems to be this kind of character that you can't quite extinguish, whose flame you can't quite extinguish. The unbreakable warriors are part of cultural legends. They are a very favorite part of national stories. I'm sure any of you watching this, whatever country you come from, you could probably name at least 3 unbreakable warriors in your country. And these are famous military generals. Generally, they are men, right? These stories tend to favor male warriors from the past. Some of the examples I would give would be Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan. These are figures, historical figures and warrior figures who were fighters that stayed and persisted through the centuries. And as they stayed and persisted through the centuries, the story around them, the narrative around them grew bigger and bigger and bigger until they became these larger than life characters that we now see as superhuman practically. And there's many circumstances of this happening in the contemporary world, but a lot of it comes from mythology. And I think it comes from our natural confirmation bias, again, in wanting something to be bigger and better than it actually is, in selling something to ourselves about the story of a certain person or the story of our own lineage or our own country or nationality. And I know, coming from the United States, some of these narratives come from fighters in the past. One of them is George Washington, one of the founding fathers of the country, who is seen as this sort of like superhuman creature that was able to defeat an entirely sophisticated army. Another one that I like, who is a rather refined philosopher of his time, was Marcus Aurelius, who was legend to have carried empires through many battles and barbarian conquer attempts. And so it's important to realize who these characters are in our stories and why they're there. And we do have some, I like to say Donald Trump likes to look at himself as an unbreakable warrior. Of course, I'm saying that without trying to have any political judgments or party affiliations and making that comment, but what he has, the persona he's kind of built of himself, in particularly in US culture and globally, I think, is that he is this an unbreakable warrior fighter type in the contemporary model. So some of our contemporary sports players, I would not be surprised if 200 or 300 years from now, and what anthropology teaches us about sports is that sports is a replacement for our natural human need to have tribal warfare in our what we consider civilized society. I don't really think humans are as civilized as we think, but what we consider to be a civilized society is actually one who has created mechanisms to repeat the same activities we have done throughout human history. And a lot of that is have wars. So sports figures now, some of our favorite soccer teams and you know, European football players or American football players or lacrosse or cricket or whatever sport we're looking at, basketball, I wouldn't be surprised if 300 to 500 years from now, again, that they would become these legendary unbreakable warrior archetypes, that stories and personas have been added to their greatness over the centuries to make this superhuman type character. So Angela, we all know in mythology, the unbreakable warrior shows up a lot. I would love to hear from your perspective, how did we get to this not only this dual narrative archetype, like how did we get to this point where we were able to have these kind of figures persist?
As a fun fact to begin, there was a Mesoamerican culture that did resolve tribal differences, not with war, but through ball games. So that's not really, yeah. That's not like a totally inept comparison. Some of my favorite examples of unbreakable warriors are Jose Rizal in Philippine culture. He was a writer who spent a lot of time critiquing and narrating the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. And now he's been folded into Philippine mysticism, for example. Sometimes he's conflated with Jesus, or, you know, for more pre-colonial Filipino affinities, the story of Urduja, who was a warrior princess, kind of like Xena, and who notably said something to the effect of, I will get married when I meet a man who is stronger than me and smarter than me and cleverer than me, and she never got married. Like that's her story. I think the interesting thing about the Unbreakable Warrior is that it does invite the idea that we do become immortal. There are a lot of ways in which we do become immortal. I think that one of the issues with the Unbreakable Warrior archetype is this belief maybe that we can control the ways in which we become immortal. The example that comes to mind is, imagine our perfectly curated Instagrams, but other people long after we die are curating them for us, you know, and sort of rewriting our stories. And we do this all the time, right? Like we do this with, you know, to take your examples, Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. I think the thing about the Unbreakable Warrior is that we get kind of an imprint of an idea of who these people are and what they represent. And we don't necessarily go into the deeper details of their stories or their traumas or their weaknesses and failures, which can become an issue for us. A very good example of this is, for example, in France, you have Joan of Arc, who is very much an unbreakable warrior figure.
She was my patron saint during my Catholic. Yes, she was always my patron saint. So
yeah. She was also, you know, her story ended in a very sad
tragic
way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you also have the figure in France of Liberté, which is fictional. Unbreakable warriors that are fictional have more of an advantage over non-fictional unbreakable warriors, right? Like Liberté is not a person who exists. She will forever just be this woman with her boobs out, guiding the people to freedom. Britain has the same thing, Britannia, who was a goddess or a figure of folklore. Interestingly, though, something happened to the idea of Britannia when the Romans came and conquered briefly the Saxons. One of the ways in which they expressed their conquest was by sort of sullying the image of Britannia. You know, like there were these frescoes of Britannia with a foot over her neck, for example.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which must have been very traumatic for the Saxons. So after the Romans were defeated, after they left, the Britons revived her as a symbol to justify their imperialism. She became sort of like the head of that imperial idea. So you can see how this can kind of sometimes arise from a trauma as well. But to return to this idea that we kind of do this all the time in different ways, we do it with Anthony Bourdain, for example. I don't know if you remember this, but I think last year after he died, there was this huge drama over this documentary that came out, and they used a deepfake technology to have his voice, saying things that he never actually said.
Oh, like a deep fake. Yes. Yeah.
So throughout history, we have done this. For example, Merlin in the Tales of King Arthur, even King Arthur himself, but let's take the example of Merlin.
We're going to do an episode on that.
Yeah. King Arthur. But Merlin is remembered as this sort of like sort of omnipotent, wise warrior wizard. His story in the narration is a lot more complicated. You know, there's actually a moment where he's so traumatized by so many deaths that he goes into the woods and kind of just like goes mad. You know, like they have to sort of fish him out. But the mythology that we collectively have of Merlin, this sort of like unbreakable warrior collective snapshot, is really different. We've also done this with a bard called Taliesin. Most bards were kind of like Patreon. They were being paid by rich people to say very flattering things and to sing very flattering things about the heroics of rich people. Taliesin was no different. If you look at his writings, that's basically what he does. He's just sort of praising his patron. But over hundreds of years, you get this kind of bardic cult of Taliesin, where they sort of attribute to him a mythology, you know, that he was a prophet, that he was the greatest, potentially immortal, like it was special to come from the line of Taliesin. But the thing that made it special actually had nothing to do with his reality. You can also say this for Alexander the Great. Notably, Alexander the Great became super paranoid and ended up killing somebody that he loved a lot, like in a fit of paranoia. So
it's funny. I wanted to mention, I told an ex-boyfriend once, who's kind of an unbreakable warrior himself, or striving to be that. I said, you know, he was being hard on himself about his PTSD. And I said, look, I'm sure Alexander the Great had PTSD, but because that narrative has been built around him that he's the superhuman, you will never hear about this vulnerability.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that that's what leads to the difficulty of the unbreakable warrior. Not only does it kind of like re-narrate and erase the reality of a person's life, maybe the danger of the unbreakable warrior is that in the same sense that it bolsters us when we need a boost and some inspiration, it also advances this idea that in order to become immortal, and by definition, in order to succeed, you cannot have vulnerabilities, you can't have weaknesses. And you can see how that works, sort of wiggles its way into things like grind culture, for example, this idea that you have to be tireless, you have to be busy all the time in order to achieve whatever it is you're seeking to achieve. You can't get lost.
Exactly. Yeah, that's true. And that's been my issue with this unbreakable warrior, is that it creates something superhuman that can't be human, because we've scrubbed out and snipped out all the vulnerabilities from that person's story and then added more elaboration as to how great this person is, which only creates a situation where we're not accepting our vulnerabilities as much as we should be.
Yeah. And I would say, instead of focusing, whenever you have an unbreakable warrior figure, it might be useful to focus on how and why they became an unbreakable warrior. For example, the Song of Hiawatha. When I think of the unbreakable warrior, I think of Hiawatha. who is immortalized to us by Longfellow as, like this character in the Song of Hiawatha, he's kind of a noble savage character, which is totally separate discussion of how that comes about. He has adventures, he falls in love, and ultimately he helps convert his people to Christianity, and that's what we know of him. But his narrative has nothing to do with the reality of Hiawatha, who actually helps create what was called the Iroquois Confederation, which was composed of 6 different nations, different indigenous nations, in part in order to manage strife between themselves, but also push back against the colonial invasion. In fact, the belt of Hiawatha, which is the symbol of sort of the pact between all of these different nations, is still used on the flag of the Iroquois Confederation. So clearly, they also have an immortal warrior story of Hiawatha, but it's really different from our immortal story of Hiawatha. And we actually don't know very much about who this guy was and how he lived, or even how he died.
I love that you're bringing this up, because one of the points I wanted to emphasize is that this Unbreakable Warrior is such a big part of our nationalism narratives. And again, we're actually going to do an episode on nationalism narratives, and very strongly try not to piss a lot of people off in any of the things we're analyzing on that. But anyway, these warriors are present in these nationalism narratives. So each country or nationality has their own, famous warrior that fought for the country's freedom, or fought for its integrity, or fought for its like solidarity and freeing it from tyranny. And this is huge. I mean, this is every culture. Anyone listening to this can probably name at least 3 of these types in your own culture.
Yeah. So it's worth, I guess, is the takeaway for me. Sometimes the tricky thing about these Unbreakable Warrior stories is that the stories are all we have when the people exist, or even in fiction, I don't know very much about who Britannia was before she became this symbol of imperialism. But I think a good way to look sideways at this is to ask yourself what the function is of the Unbreakable Warrior scaffolding around them. Like, regardless of the reality of your life, what is the takeaway that you're being asked to receive from that story? Is it sort of like a trauma bolstering story? Is it a nationhood superiority story? And these things will often tell you a lot more about what is important to people as to advance their own ideas of progress, than they will about the reality of that person or that entity, and by extension, your own reality. Like, our lives are messy, right? And that's just generally true for all of humanity.
I would tell everyone to realize that we are all breakable to a certain extent. And maybe we are all crackable, not necessarily entirely breakable, but no person should ever discredit themselves for not being this unbreakable warrior, because the reality is a lot of these people have centuries of myths surrounding them, or big elaborate stories surrounding them that get added and added and added over the generations. Some of the people that we see now, I wonder what people will be saying about some of the figures that we have now that are considered unbreakable warriors 500 years from now. What will the actual story end up being all of these centuries later? And will it actually be a true story? We don't know. But if we could go back in time and see how some of these people, like Alexander the Great, were actually living and what their vulnerabilities are, it would have changed our mind about how we look at them as immortal beings. And yes, we all want to live forever. The reality is, unless you do believe in reincarnation, we will not live forever. The point is to try to contribute as best as possible while you are here, to continue that creation, that line of creation.
Yeah. And in the instances where we do live forever, I suppose it merits saying that it's not really our choice how we live forever. I'm sure hundreds of years from now, Prince will be remembered as a god. But, but
Exactly.
I also want to sort of like take this opportunity to give a shout out to Trisha Hersey, who developed the NAP ministry, whose tagline is "Rest is Revolution." I really love this idea that you can kind of not only embrace your own weakness and embrace this idea that this is a chaotic time and we're all sort of like endemically tired, but also to seize on this idea of rest as being a subversive act, because I actually do think that's true. You don't get a lot of stories about that, but that's also the reality. Like if you want to enjoy your life, probably, I don't know, you have to make a choice between making yourself an epic, which is harder and harder to do, and creating a situation where you actually can just have a diversity of experiences that you enjoy and share with other people.
That's a powerful way of saying that. Interestingly enough, this notion, one of the biggest warriors that I remember throughout history was Geoffroy de Charny, who was a knight who fought in the 100 Years' War and who wrote this book called A Knight's Own Guide to Chivalry. And even though he lived 800 years ago, he has an Amazon author page.
Nice.
And which I think is quite cool, actually. You know, someone else.
Maybe that's immortality.
there you are. And he has this in this book, he was one of the first warrior types, this unbreakable warrior archetype, to actually publicly come out and say, here's how you be a good knight and a good warrior. Part of that is vulnerability. Part of that is respecting women. Part of that is respecting vulnerable members of your community. Part of that is taking care of yourself and your own well-being. And this was a really radical notion back then, when there were shows of masculinity everywhere. Whoever fought at the joust and won was the toughest and the best and the bravest. And for him to come out as I would say this was a true Renaissance man. I mean, he was a warrior. He fought as a knight. He also was a writer. Another rare thing, whenever writing was not so, democratic back in these days, and only privileged few could actually learn to be literate and to write. And I believe he was also a musician, if my sources are correct. So you've got this person who could have lived all these centuries later as this, impenetrable super being, but he actually put in writing one of the first texts that encourages strong men to exhibit these signs that what would normally be considered weakness, but he actually says, no, this is the true chivalry. And that's he's actually one of my favorite authors throughout history for all of those reasons, because he sort of was that archetype, but dispelled that archetype at the same time,
Yeah, I love this. I love this. You're also reminding me, obviously, we would be remiss if we didn't mention Jesus, who was a historical figure. The Romans were nothing if not very good bookkeepers and bureaucrats. But, because his story was conflated with so much mythology and also very particular politics of the time, people are still having fights about what Jesus represents and what his cult means and what he really would have wanted, which I'm not sure, like the original Jewish zealot Jesus, zealot as defined in the political sense of that time, would really align with. I'm thinking of Roe versus Wade, for example. I don't think that would be the jam of the guy who, sat and hung out with prostitutes, even though his disciples were like, ew, they're so dirty. So yeah, so there are a lot of ways in which this myth is also weaponized for many types of purposes, but can also be, like in the same sense that they can encourage and help us, they can be weaponized against us and even whole societies.
I'm glad you brought up that weaponization, because that is a huge factor, and that is in many ways what's happening now. I made the statement about Donald Trump being a sort of a contemporary person that is attempting to paint this indefeatable warrior archetype around himself. And I think what a lot of that comes from is these industrial revolution titans of industry that
Sure.
he's contemporarily trying to emulate: the Rockefeller, the Carnegie,
The founding fathers.
the founding fathers, and
Yeah.
and be seen as this contemporary, real estate tycoon and business tycoon. But and arguably many sources would say that this was not the case. So but that's a whole nother story, and I will not get deeply into that. It's just, I think this is a little bit of the narrative being constructed around someone like him, is that he wants to see himself, and he wants to be remembered throughout history as that resilient, strong, masculine figure type. Yeah. So.
But this also takes us to a very old definition of truth, which is not hard facts. Like that idea is quite new. It's more the kernel of truth in the middle of the story. So this is quite an ancient practice.
We are so happy that you joined us again on Narrative Dive to talk about the narrative/archetype of the Unbreakable Warrior. We hope this was insightful for you. And our next episode will be on future and dystopian narratives, one of my favorite topics, as I'm writing quite a bit about this these days, especially with some of the Web3 topics that I'm touching on. And also that Angela's editing and touching on as well. We're both very steeped in this space at the moment. Some would call it the dystopian beat. So this is going to be a very exciting episode for us. So please come back and see us on your quest for truth.